So now we're going to go to day 2. We've got the basics down from day 1. We see the pattern. We're in comfortable mode now. We understand a little better what God is doing, starting with very basic things. And now we're ready to see him take all of that matter that has no form, all the energy and the light and so on, and now he's going to start, almost like you can imagine a child with Play-Doh. He's going to start forming things now from the raw materials. And we're going to see that coming together in day 2 and onward. So, with your chart, we started with matter, energy, light, time, and so on. Now we're moving into the second box, day 2. And in day 2, we read, "Then God said, 'Let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters.' God made the expanse and separated the waters which were below the expanse from the waters which were above the expanse, and it was so. God called the expanse heaven, and there was evening and there was morning, a second day." All right, so we have some work to do, but with what we've already learned, it'll go a little quicker. Let's start with a general overview. God begins now in day 2 to bring order to that formless void of nothingness that he started with in day 1, the matter that is not in any kind of specific form. Which substance does he begin with? Where do we go first from nothing to something? He begins with water. The first molecule made was H2O. And this is in keeping with what the New Testament says. Peter says that when people mock the truth of creation, he says when they do that, it escapes their notice that by the word of God the heavens existed long ago and the earth was formed out of water and by water. Peter's reminding us that the first thing God did was to make water. And of course, in the context of 2 Peter, what Peter goes on to do in a quite ironic, almost mocking way himself, is he says, those mockers, they forget God made water and started everything with water, and then he dumped a bunch of water on them in the flood, and he's not done yet. He's going to come back and destroy them with fire. His point was, they've never learned, they never will. They missed the whole point. But it did start with water. And then we read, God separated the waters. So there's water. Now we read it becomes a plural word, waters, because he separates them. So there was water. Now there's waters made necessary by an expanse. Let's take a moment to look at the word expanse. It's rakia in Greek. It's rakia in Hebrew. And it's an interesting word. The word expanse, it works. I mean, in English, there aren't a lot of options for what this word is. It's kind of a hard word to translate. It could also be translated in extended surface. Let me show you what I mean. So let's say there's some waters, and there's some waters. And you look at the difference between them, and you think, oh yeah, that's an expanse. But that's where the word fails you, because rakia doesn't mean necessarily a gap. This is what it means. It just means a separation. So it's not about some distance between the waters. It's not like you imagine them some distance apart. Think of it more in terms of a separation by different forms. By changing waters into different forms, I create a barrier or a meeting point between those two forms, which is a rakia, which is an expanse. So let's look at that now. We have two bodies of waters, and the Bible, in what we read, referred to one of them as heaven. Remember that? But here we are again with our concern over the word heaven, right? So heaven is shamayim. It can mean sky, it can mean outer space, it can mean God's throne room. In fact, the Jews were always so concerned about not misunderstanding this that they came to use this little convention. They began to number them. First heaven, second heaven, third heaven, first shamayim, second shamayim, and so on. And the numbers simply designate which space. So they went from the ground up. So first heaven would be atmosphere, where the birds fly. Second heaven would be outer space, where the planets are. Third heaven was the Jewish way of saying where God is. That's why Paul says he was taken up to the third heaven. He's referencing the heaven, as in God's heaven. That's where he went. And it's all because their language doesn't give them a variety of words for the same thing in this case, so they had to come up with that little convention. So how do I know which of the three I'm talking about if they don't use the number? Like in this case, when God says that he separated the waters above the heavens, etc., above the expanse. Well, it means we have to look at the context to understand what he's talking about. So in this case, which shamayim do you think was created on day 2? He's taken waters, he has made them separate in form, and he's put one, it says, above the heavens, or above the heaven. Which one of those heavens are we talking about? Now let me show you how you can get the answer by context. It's sort of cheating, but it's a legitimate form of cheating. You look at your chart here and you realize that you're creating spaces on the left and you're going to fill those spaces on the days on the right. So if I look at what happens in day 5, I can see what God is putting in the spaces that he's creating now that we're trying to make sense of. What do I see when I go back and I look at day 5? Well, I'll tell you. You find sea creatures and birds. So what does that mean he's putting in this day? Well, you have at the top, which of the waters? You have the atmosphere. By the way, the sky is about 4% water. In fact, you take all the air around the globe and all the water that's in it, you get about as much water as one of our larger oceans. And, of course, what's below it then? We'll come back to that because he doesn't talk to that yet. On day 2, God suspends 2 kinds of water in nothingness. Now, stop thinking about the world you know today, because the world you know today is after day 6. Start thinking about what's in day 2. We just took nothing, literally nothing, just matter without form, and he just made water. What's around the water? Nothing. Nothing. So what does water look like if you put it in nothing? Well, did you imagine something like this? No, don't imagine that, because that's not what actually happens. Water outside of a gravitational force assumes the shape of a sphere because of the surface tension of water molecules. There's a shot of a bubble of a drop of water floating in the space station. So if you just take water absent any gravitational force and it's just suspended in free gravity, it just becomes a perfect globe. So if you want to imagine what God creating waters looks like on day 2, this is what you should be imagining. It's a globe. The reason the earth is round is because it started with water in the middle of nothing. And water forms this perfect sphere in nothing. And then, of course, he surrounded that with another form of water, an atmosphere, which created atmospheric pressure, which made for the perfect environment from which everything else was about to appear. You know, if you don't have the proper habit trail and you put the hamster in too quickly, it's not going to do well. So you have water, and that yellow line obviously represents the expanse that we just heard about. It's not a giant gap, it's a meeting point. So you have one kind of water on another kind of water in the middle of nothing, and they form a perfect globe, something that must have looked a little bit like that, just with no land and nothing else yet. So, day 2, you have atmosphere and water, just as Peter said. A space that God will later fill.